Hi, and welcome to Your Chance to See Episode 2, Northeastern Wyoming. As you can see, my dart hit just about midway between Gillette and Devil's Tower. As you drive west along I-90, you pass through South Dakota, probably stopping at Mount Rushmore or in the Black Hills. But then the landscape starts to change. As you get deeper into the rain shadow of the Rockies, the ecosystem starts to get drier. Not long after passing into Wyoming, you see Devil's Tower National Monument, which is pictured behind me. This is a spectacular geological formation. It's a magma tube that formed within sedimentary rocks more than 50 million years ago. Over those 50 million years, the sandstone and limestone layers have eventually eroded away, leaving this spectacular massif standing up here in the mixed prairie, dotted with ponderosa pine. Now, most people are likely to go ooh and ah at the tower and then move on towards Jackson Hole, the Grand Tetons, or Yellowstone. But we're going to stop here. And I'm going to try and make the argument that that is not the most amazing part of this landscape. We're in the middle of the Thunder Basin grassland ecosystem. This is a region that's a transition zone between the tallgrass prairie to the east and the sagebrush steppe to the west, with a narrow band of shortgrass prairie right here that flares out a little bit as you move toward the south. And while we think of the bison that once roamed these grasslands and hills, the region is also home to grassland elk, pronghorn antelope, and mule deer. The land is now mostly in private ownership, but I want to tell you about a group of landowners that have joined forces to try and conserve this region and protect the golden eagles, the black-tailed prairie dogs, the greater sage grouse, the burrowing owls, ferruginous hawks, and the very diverse suite of grassland birds that thrive here. To do this, I enlisted the help of some local experts to explain what gets them excited about this region. We're going to hear from Dave Palatz, the Executive Director of the Thunder Basin Grassland Prairie Ecosystem Association, Dr. Lauren Perensky, a researcher from the USDA Grassland Research Institute in Fort Collins, and from Trey Davis, who works at the Nature Conservancy. You can stick around at the end of the video where I chat with each of these folks about their work in the region, and you can learn more about the conservation actions that are going on here. However, before we get there, let's see if the four of us can convince you that there's a whole lot more to see here than the Devil's Tower, as spectacular as that is.
So there's a lot of really interesting things if they get off the main roads. Slow down, spend some time. We've got some really neat sites. One, for example, down in the what we call the Cow Creek Buttes. It's about 10 miles east of Bill, which is a really bubbling metropolis of, I think there's now 4 people there, and a school and a hotel, actually. So we have the Lady Bird Johnson Road that goes up into kind of up into the hills and then back way away from anywhere. And you can really get a sense of what this landscape would have been like, a couple hundred years ago or a couple thousand years ago. Really, no fences, no real signs of industrial activity. Super quiet. Just kind of a neat place to really get a sense for what what these prairie systems look like.
But what I would tell you is put your face down in there and you'll see some cool stuff. There's all kinds of plant diversity and insects. And just, on the larger animal side, we've got crazy amounts of pronghorn and elk, deer, all kinds of grassland birds. Grassland birds are like declining really fast in this region. So we're an area where you can see a lot of them still thriving. And there's no people. I mean, it's like you'll see pronghorn in your yard every day and you'll see maybe one truck drive by. So it's beautiful. I really encourage people to go check it out. David Augustine looked at fragmentation rates across the Great Plains, and this part of Wyoming is one of the least fragmented areas. So we don't have a lot of fragmentation, and that's hugely beneficial for grassland birds and our ungulates and a lot of other species that live in this system.
So where are the cool places that you like to go that are sort of off people's radar?
Yeah, I mean, Thunder Basin National Grassland is all free and you can camp, disperse camp anywhere. There's the Cheyenne and Antelope rivers run through Thunder Basin National Grassland, and there are these beautiful gallery cottonwood forests along the rivers that are really just very nice to camp in. And then we have these bluffs there's all these layers of rock. And so we have these bluffs that have all these different colors. We have like red and white and black. And that's also why the area is so rich for coal mining, because it has all these sedimentary layers from being on the edge of these huge seas. And so it's beautiful. And on some of the hills, we have these ponderosa pine stands that have lots of elk hanging out, huge bull elk. I mean, it's gorgeous. So it's pretty easy to access once you drive out there, and you can sort of explore it.
The Nature Conservancy property that I work on is right in the center of that basin. It's a place where the sagebrush steppe and the shortgrass prairie overlap, amongst other things. And I am inspired by the unique expression of the organisms that live there. And an example would be species of sage that grow in sagebrush steppe in western Wyoming or in the basin, but express themselves with a different growth form, deal with a different set of challenges. Additionally, the plants, the other plants themselves, for instance, grasses, they're dealing with this system of fire and ice, dryness, unpredictable precipitation. I admire the grasses for having so much biomass under the ground with such narrow leaves on the top to deal with those varying conditions I just mentioned. Also, I'm inspired by the whole, the land itself, the long sight lines, the storms that come in so unpredictably, the fact that I can look across that landscape and envision what it might have been like 200 years ago, though it has changed. I admire the sparseness of the human population, their ability to live in tandem in a working landscape with those factors that I previously mentioned.
Now, many of the areas that these folks are referring to that get them excited are on the Thunder Basin National Grassland. This is just one of 20 national grasslands managed by our U.S. Forest Service. I also asked Dave about greater sage grouse. They're a sage steppe species, and this is the very eastern edge of that ecosystem type. And so it's the eastern edge of their range. I'm first going to show you about 30 seconds of video from my UC Davis colleague, Gail Patricelli. This footage is from Nevada, I believe, but it serves to show you how impressive it is that these males trying to attract females on the breeding grounds called leks. After the video, I will let Dave tell you about the breeding grounds, or leks, where the males do these behaviors and what they're doing to monitor those birds. And here's Dave on the leks of Thunder Basin.
You have a few working leks in your landscape?
Yes, so our leks are fairly small. We're right on the edge of the range. We will end up in another 20, 30 miles further east, be out of sagebrush. But we do have leks, low attendance for the most part. If you think about a lek in the true sage steppe, our big leks are 20 to maybe 30 birds, and occasionally up to 50 or 60. But at that point, you're really getting a big lek for us. So yeah, I do a route. There's a number of us that work in cooperation with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department to monitor leks, and so we go out. We'll start here in a couple months, and out there a little bit before dawn, and it's always a lot of fun.
Okay, that's our pitch. Pretty awesome nature. Clearly, all three of my guests were taken not just by the wildlife, or in Lauren's case, the plants, but by the landscapes and the capacity to come out to Thunder Basin and see a landscape as it may have been before cell phones, cars, interstate freeways, or even fences. To imagine this landscape as the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Cree, the indigenous people who called this land their home saw it. But please stick around. Managing this landscape is not without its challenges. And one of the coolest things I learned was how these really dedicated people are working to keep this landscape intact for the wildlife as well as the ranchers that call Thunder Basin home.
Today we're talking with Dave Pellets about the Thunder Basin Grassland Prairie Ecosystem Association and his work there. Dave, thanks for being with me and spending some time with me talking about the area. Um, I wonder if you could just start by telling us a little bit about the work of your organization.
Sure. Mark, it's nice to be here and to share a little bit about this part of eastern Wyoming. Thunder Basin Grasslands Prairie Ecosystem Association, or TBUGP as we call it, was started back in 1999 by a group of ranchers in the local area that was very interested in conservation as well as really developing a science-based approach to management of the area. They were concerned at that point about black-tailed prairie dogs, and there had been a proposed listing way back in the late 90s. And that was kind of the impetus to get energized and to put a group together. And then the group has stayed together. We now work with some of our energy companies. The surface coal mines in the area have been partners since 2001. And we've been able to get a lot of really good conservation put on the ground.
Yeah, great, thanks. And so as you mentioned, this coalition came together. There was the set of federal agreements on the conservation, well, the CCAA, so candidate conservation agreements with assurances and all those other federal acronyms. Has that group been pretty consistent, or do you continue to grow the group by enrolling new lands?
We stay fairly consistent. That was a very, very lengthy process. We started as soon as the mines joined in 2001, really started really working with the Fish and Wildlife Service at that point. And we didn't have a signed agreement. There were a few bobbles along the way, but we didn't have a signed agreement until 2017. So it was a long haul. And as you mentioned, the conservation strategy does include the CCAA, so candidate conservation agreements with assurances for private lands, a CCA, which drops that assurances part for federal surface, and then just a plain old vanilla conservation agreement that enabled us to kind of bridge the listing for a set of 8 species, including the black-tailed prairie dogs, which is, as I mentioned, where we started.
Yeah.
Fish and Wildlife Service sits on the Conservation Advisory Committee, but we actually, the board itself actually enrolls members if they meet the criteria that we'd set up with Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's kind of at the time, it was a very innovative approach. They had never done a conservation agreement that covered that many different pieces, nor covered that many different species. So it was kind of groundbreaking in that standpoint, but we had wanted a conservation strategy that basically covered our entire ecosystem. And initially, the group had proposed that they cover like 1,000 different species, and Fish and Wildlife Service just said, "Oh, we can't deal with that."
Yeah.
And so we came back with 8 that we felt comfortable with, broke them into 2 different assemblages, so kind of represent the endpoints of the vegetative habitats that we have. So shoregrass prairie on one end with 4 species there, and then on the other side, sage steppe with 4 species there as well. And what we didn't cover, we were always going to go back to and cover the middle ground, but we were not able to, we've not been able to do that. So we can enroll new ranchers as they come on board. We've done that to some extent. But there needs to be kind of an outside impetus, if you will, before people will get interested to the point of really signing the document. So we have a lot of people that are doing some of the conservation measures that we have established, but not really going forward with the full set of documents that would be necessary to enroll their properties and have coverage.
Well, that's interesting. So you'd say that one of the things one of the impacts that your organization has is by helping spread these best practices even amongst people who aren't on the signed agreements.
Yeah, so that's actually been one of the ways that I think that we've been fairly successful. We had worked with a group of 20, 30 people that had expertise in this area, and to develop conservation measures that would be appropriate for the area and for the species that we were looking at. And with those, regardless of whether you're going to go ahead and get the conservation protections, those those approaches, pardon me, those approaches have been really helpful in, if somebody says, well, I'd like to do something, but I really don't know what to do. Basically, there's 176 different measures, and you can say, hey, you can choose one of those, and they'll all do good things for various aspects of the habitats that we're working with. One of the big things that we've been doing is encouraging people to develop some drought tolerant grazing plans. And that actually has been, I think, probably the most successful of the various conservation strategies that we've developed. Of course, they're pretty robust. They require a lot of input. But if nothing else, just the thinking through of, are you going to rotate? Where's your water? What are your fences? What are your pasture sizes? What's the habitat? What's the veg in there? All of those pieces have really, I think, given people a new way of looking at the land.
Today I'm talking with Lauren Perensky, who's with the Rangeland Resources and Systems Research Center from the USDA in Fort Collins. And she does a lot of her work up in this corner of Northeast Wyoming that we're talking about. And so, Lauren, let me first just ask you a little bit about your research. What do you do up there?
Yeah, so I was hired by the Ag Research Service back in 2013. And at that time, there was a group of folks up in Northeast Wyoming who were asking for more science on rangelands up there. And so my group decided, we should hire a rangeland scientist to go up and address stakeholder problems in Northeast Wyoming. So I was hired in 2013 to start that program.
Great. And some of that work is on cheatgrass. Is that right?
Yeah. So when I started, I had come from previously working in the Great Basin to the west, and cheatgrass is a huge problem all over the western United States, but particularly in Nevada and areas in the Great Basin. And so I was really curious about the threat of cheatgrass in Northeast Wyoming and what we could do about it. Interesting story. So in the Great Basin, we have this fire cheatgrass invasion feedback cycle where we have more fires, which cause more invasion, and the invasive species causes more fires. So we sort of get this in this cycle of invasion and fire. And I was really curious whether that same dynamic operated in Thunder Basin. So I did a bunch of work, both observational and experimental, on fire in this region of Northeast Wyoming. And what we found was actually pretty surprising. We found that fire didn't seem to be associated with increased cheatgrass in this region.
Wow.
Yeah, which was interesting. I started looking more at papers from further east in the Great Plains and found that actually that story holds in areas further east as well. And we think it's because the native perennial grasses are just so well adapted to fire and good at resisting invasion after fire. They're able to bounce right back after fire, and cheatgrass can't really get a foothold in the system. So then I started studying effects of grazing on cheatgrass. And folks in the region were concerned about grazing causing cheatgrass invasion. We had this series of exclosures that had been around since like the 1940s that the Forest Service put up way back when, and University of Wyoming put them up with the Forest Service and then sort of forgot about them. And we went and looked at these exclosures and found actually inside the exclosures where there hadn't been grazing in however long, 50, 60 years, we had 3 times as much cheatgrass as outside the exclosures. Wow. Yeah, so the lack of grazing actually also caused or was associated with more invasion. And we think that has to do with, again, the fact that this system evolved with bison. It's really well adapted to grazing, and in the absence of grazing, things kind of get messed up in the system. So yeah, interesting cheatgrass stories.
Yeah, and so my understanding is that this is a real transition zone from the sagebrush steppe in the west through that narrow band of shortgrass prairie to tallgrass prairie, and that Thunder Basin has a little bit of all of that. So this story with how cheatgrass responds to grazing and fire, do you think it has to do does it change along that transition of aridity?
Yeah, absolutely. It's aridity and it's also timing of precip. So further west, we get wintertime precip, and further east, we get summertime precip. I love Thunder Basin because it's so diverse. You have these species that occur in the Great Basin, species that occur in the Great Plains, and they're all living together in this ecosystem. And it's very strange. Like you have sage grouse living with black-tailed prairie dogs, which are like a Great Plains species, and they're all sort of coexisting. And that's exciting because it's diverse, but it's also exciting for me as a scientist because things respond in surprising ways to disturbances in that system.
Yeah, cool. So there's the Thunder Basin National Grassland, but an awful lot of this land that you're working on is in private ownership with ranches. So a lot of what you're doing is in a public-private partnership. I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about your experience working that way.
Yeah, our program really is founded in that idea of public-private partnerships. We collaborate closely with the Thunder Basin Grasslands Prairie Ecosystem Association, which is a landowner-led group in Northeast Wyoming. And we all try and come up with problems that are locally relevant. For example, managing prairie dogs is a big issue on the grasslands, both for the Forest Service as a public entity and for private landowners. So we've started doing a lot of research around that issue and sort of just trying to infuse some data and science into the conversation and help where we can. And really, like, the research has shifted as issues on the ground have shifted, you know, whether that's more drought or more prairie dogs. We had a decline in pronghorn recently. So whatever's going on, our research program really tries to adapt and focus on what's relevant. So I think just the importance of like working landscapes in the region is worth mentioning. Another thing that I would say is just, for me, what's been really powerful is the interest of the local community in science and having locally relevant science done to support their management. So we've seen, you know, not that I've done a ton of work, but the work that we've done up there has directly translated into shifts in the Forest Service management strategies and NRCS, how NRCS is building site descriptions for the area. So it's a place where there's so little known that anything you can do, really, people are using that information. So that's fun to see as a scientist.
So today I'm talking with Trey Davis, who works for the Nature Conservancy in Wyoming. You're the Eastern Wyoming land steward. Is that
Wyoming Stewardship Director.
Stewardship Director? Yes, thanks. So maybe you could tell us a bit about your work. What does that entail, directing stewardship for the Nature Conservancy?
Now, in Wyoming, we have 5 key properties that are open to the public, and I would invite people to look at the Nature Conservancy's Wyoming-specific website, Places We Protect. The Nature Conservancy uses a variety of tools: protection, which is conservation easements. We have a restoration lab in Lander that is doing work that can affect places beyond the state. For instance, disused mining lands that need reclamation. So we have quite an impressive science team. Then we have a group of land managers. And one of the ways we utilize properties is to affect conservation beyond those boundaries. So it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm out visiting other landowners, which I do quite a bit, but the key part of my land management job is utilizing, for instance, the Tin Sleep Preserve to practice conservation measures. So for over 2 decades, I've had the privilege of supervising the management of our Irene property. I have a daughter named after the place, by the way. That's how much it means to me. But the thing is, it's top dead center in mechanics terms of the basin where those things come together. The density of prairie dog towns, for instance, there fluctuates, but it can be very, very great. We do invite researchers who are studying certain topics there. We do many different surveys there, for instance, burrowing owls, prairie dogs. I've had people from Kansas looking for certain species of grass. So by special permission, we do allow folks on, but the way we manage that is as part of the working landscape. So it is leased presently to an adjacent neighbor who looks after our place, utilizes it as a working part of the ranch, also has conservation easements on their own place. So it's a collaborative puzzle piece that provides us the opportunity to be part of this incredible community. And I got to tell you, as a young land steward, when I first started working there, to be invited at the Pellets Ranch table, Dave Pellets' mother's ranch and father's, their family ranch. I was invited to sit at the table in their living room with his mother, his late mother, who is the founder of this organization, in the middle of a working landscape where people voluntarily get together and decide to affect conservation about this place they care so deeply. So a huge part of my job is collaboration. It's been very inspiring for me, and I've been able to carry that, what I've learned there, outward into other parts of the Great Plains and in other parts of my job, including in the mountains.
These guys had to have been one of the first groups to start working with the Fish and Wildlife Service to get these things online, and it took them a long time to do it, a lot of perseverance. It's, you got to admire a group that will stick with it and have that much dedication to the process.
Dedication through generations and
Yeah,
over decades,
yeah.
and through all those challenging conditions of the landscape while being a part of the working landscape too. Just very impressive. I did want to add something that I'm proud of that the Nature Conservancy is doing. We are fond of cross-boundary initiatives, so boundaries that go beyond state lines, for instance. So some of my work occurs outside of Wyoming. We have a team called the Northern Great Plains team, and right now we're in the midst of organizing what we'll be doing for the next decade. And the Thunder Basin is one of the key landscapes across the Northern Great Plains that we're concentrating on, largely thanks to those people who we were talking about that have put so much effort into protecting the plants and animals out there.
Mhm.
There's a lake very nearby,
Yeah.
and the birds utilize the property,
Right.
but not right on the property. We do see the other species you mentioned,
Yeah.
burrowing owls, prairie dogs, the swift foxes, the ferruginous hawks above,
Yeah.
variety of sparrows that are so inspiring.
Yeah.
But sage grouse themselves is one of my favorite organisms. Well, my ear perked up when I heard you say that people can get to. And one of the most interesting, there are plenty of roads in this system, but one of the interesting things about the place is those ephemeral conditions, changing conditions, the mud in spring, the wind drifts in fall of snow provide challenge no matter what. But I like that. I like the checkerboarded pattern of ownership. I like the fact that there are national grasslands, public lands that one can go to and be by oneself. Doesn't mean you can't be seen with those long sight lines, but you can find a place there. And I'm intrigued by places where you really need to check your fuel tank before you head out. Uh, I tried to take our board out there one year, the Nature Conservancy's Wyoming chapter board, and we had to adapt, just like the organisms do. We had unexpected flooding. The Cheyenne River was flooding the road. My board never got to go to
Mhm.
our own property. And I like that there's a little work to it. I recommend that folks have plenty of air in their tires, have a spare, have plenty of water, and look at maps carefully.
Okay, thanks for sticking it out all the way to the end, and thanks to Trey Davis of the Nature Conservancy, Lauren Perensky of the USDA Agricultural Research Service, and Dave Pellets of the Thunder Basin Grassland Prairie Ecosystem Alliance for sharing their thoughts on this wonderful ecosystem. Join us next time for episode 3 of Your Chance to See, where we head to Western Michigan, and I talk to some folks from the Land Conservancy of Western Michigan and the state DNR. And we check in with the Conner Blue, the Great Lakes, and the glacial landscapes of the upper Midwest. Thanks. Bye.